I'd
All
like
right, well,
to go
thank
ahead.
you everyone for coming to this second seminar in our Weisenthal colloquium series. I'm happy to say our speaker today is Katie Dagon, and I will let Dr. Kosminski introduce Katie, or Dr. Dagon, sorry.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm really excited to have Dr. Dagan here to present today. She's a project scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, working in the Climate and Global Dynamics Laboratory. Her research focuses on modeling the impacts of climate change on land-atmosphere interactions, climate variability, and extreme events. She's also interested in machine learning approaches to climate science, including the quantifying uncertainty and model projections of climate change. From 2017 to 2019, she was an advanced study program postdoc at NCAR. She obtained her PhD in Earth and Planetary Science from Harvard in 2017, and her Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics and Physics from Brown in 2010. Her doctoral research focused on understanding the impacts of solar geoengineering on land-atmosphere interactions. Katie is active in the science communication and public engagement, and is working to support diversity and inclusion efforts across the earth sciences. And I'll note, where I came across her was the APS topical group on climate. So really happy to have Dr. Dagan here to present to us today. I guess that's one of the advantages of having virtual meetings. We can have scientists from all over the country come and give lectures on a Friday afternoon. So let's welcome Dr. Katie Dagan.
Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks for the invitation. I'm glad we were able to connect and work out a time to do this virtual talk. Let me just check. You guys are seeing the full screen version of my slides. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I can't see anyone's video while I'm in full screen. So just feel free to unmute and interrupt me if something goes wrong with the slides or the presentation. But yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. As Joe said, I work on climate modeling at NCAR, which is in Boulder, Colorado. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about a couple different things. I wanted to sort of start by talking about climate modeling generally, and then talk about what I'm interested in particular, which is the interactions between the land and the atmosphere and how we model those, how we simulate those, especially with changing climate. And then I'll also talk about some of the work I'm doing with machine learning techniques for understanding and quantifying uncertainty in climate models. So I always like to start some of my more general talks with this figure because I really try and center my work around understanding and communicating climate science and impacts. And so if you haven't seen this graph before, it's a pretty important graph in climate science. It's the record of observed atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. This is commonly referred to as the Keeling curve, named after the scientist Charles Keeling, who started these measurements back in the late 1950s. You can see that's how far the record extends. And what I really like about this figure is that it shows kind of two different things. It shows the increase in atmospheric CO2 over time as humans have exerted influence on the carbon cycle through anthropogenic emissions. But it also shows, and that's sort of the black line, which is the annual mean, but it also shows the monthly values in red. And so you can see that while there's an upward trend, there's also a cycle in atmospheric CO2. And this is a kind of a powerful way of demonstrating the influence of the biosphere on the carbon cycle. So the reason we see those cycles is because plants are photosynthesizing seasonally. They're taking up CO2. That's when you see the dips in the red line. And then in the off season in winter in the Northern Hemisphere, they're respiring that CO2. So you kind of can see both things from this curve, which is nice, and it ties into what I do, which is think about interactions between the biosphere and the atmosphere. I also like to show this graphic, this visualization, as a demonstration of how increases in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are leading to increases in temperature. So this is a visualization developed by Ed Hawkins at the University of Reading. And it's commonly referred to as the climate spiral, because what it's showing is over time, how the global mean surface temperature is changing relative to some baseline period. So you're sort of starting closer to zero, and then as it goes through each month of each year, starting back in 1850, you can see the temperature starting to spiral out, getting closer and closer to these thresholds of 1.5 or 2 degrees C of temperature change. So I think this is a really effective visualization for us as climate scientists. And then the other schematic that I like to sort of start with is to narrow in on what I mean when I talk about land-atmosphere interactions. And so this is a figure showing how radiation, energy from the sun interacts with the surface, and how that changes the radiation that's emitted in the form of long-wave radiation upwards, how that changes based on whether you have simply wet soil or dry soil. And so this is what I mean by land-atmosphere interactions. If you compare the figure on the left showing the interaction with wet soil, you can see that more of that energy that's emitted from the surface is in the form of latent heat flux versus sensible heat flux. And that has implications for what we feel in terms of temperature near the surface. It also has implications for the boundary layer, which is just the layer of the atmosphere that's closest to the surface. So you can see how the colored arrows, the blue and red arrows, are different sizes when you're interacting with wet versus dry soils. And that really just comes down to that water in the soil and how much water is available to transmit that energy through evaporation. And these can have like global scale effects. The influence of vegetation and wet versus dry soils can have really important global scale effects on temperature changes and how we think temperature is going to change in different places in the future. And then also on the communication side, just before I dive into the science a little bit, I wanted to just show some images from some communication activities that I've been lucky enough to participate in. During normal times, of course, we were able to go to a science fair in DC, that's the top right picture, and demonstrate how weather and atmospheric science concepts to kids of all ages. Been able to present on how we use the climate model to students and undergrads and graduate students, and be able to interact with lots of different folks. So it's definitely an important part of what I do as a scientist. So let's dive right into climate modeling. I wasn't sure how much everyone would be familiar with these tools, so I want to take some time to explain what they are and how we use them. And so we're really using climate models to study changes over lots of different timescales, but I in particular look at future climate changes and uncertainties in those changes. And so I like this figure from NOAA, kind of highlighting how we separate the Earth into lots of different tiny boxes. Those are called grid boxes or grid cells. And it's not just in 2 dimensions that we do this, but we have to do it in 3 dimensions. So this example is showing height in the atmosphere, but we also extend ocean models with depth in the ocean and soil models with depth in the soil. So 3 dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions in a lot of different senses. And then the red box is sort of like, okay, zooming in on like 1 grid cell. There's also a lot of different processes that we have to represent. And those processes, change as you go to different places on the globe. But there's a lot of complexity jammed into 1 tiny grid box. And so we use these climate models to do lots of different things, study changes both in space and in time, past, present, and future. And I'll talk a lot about the interactions between the systems. So we're not just interested in the atmosphere, but how the atmosphere interacts with the land, how the ocean and the atmosphere interact, how polar regions interact with the surrounding ocean and atmosphere. And these models are useful because we can use them to test management and policy decisions, and also to understand how our choices can impact natural systems. Oh, and then the other thing I want to mention here is that this NOAA graphic says this is a schematic for a global atmosphere model. I'm kind of going to use some of these terms interchangeably. So global atmospheric model, Earth system model, climate model. I'm going to kind of use them all in the same context just for some clarification. So let me talk specifically about the climate model that we use at NCAR, and that's called the Community Earth System Model, or CESM. And as I said before, these models are made up of interactions between lots of different components. So we have an atmosphere model, we have ice sheet models over land and over sea, we have an ocean model and a land model. And those are all interacting computationally through this coupling system. And you can see how they're interacting with each other, the different arrows. But we also have things that we can input to the model. So for example, radiation, like solar radiation changes, emissions in terms of both natural and anthropogenic, so human emissions. And from the land side, how we're changing the use of our land surfaces over time. For example, more agriculture, that's what I mean by land use changes. And the other kind of neat thing about this graphic from Alexander and Easterbrook is that the size of the bubbles that they drew here, it's not random. At the time when they made it, which is a couple years ago now, but at the time when they made it, the size of the bubbles is scaled to the number of lines of computer code in each of those subset models. So you could see how in 2011, the atmosphere model dominated in terms of the, I guess you could say the overall complexity, the number of lines of computer code needed, with the land and the ocean following. Now, I was trying to reflect on how this has changed since 2011. And I think what I would say is that the bubbles have grown, but they've all kind of grown proportionally, though the ocean might be starting to overtake a little bit because we've been adding lots of complexity to the ocean model, especially in terms of ecosystem changes and biogeochemistry. So that's just an aside for kind of some background on this figure. The other important part of our work is that we have to use high performance computing because these models are very computationally intensive and you can't just run them on your laptop, unfortunately. Now with cloud computing, we're starting to try and experiment with ways that people can actually run them on their laptop. But in general, we have to use these HPC resources. So we have a supercomputer, it's called Cheyenne because it's in Wyoming. And we have a whole division at NCAR called the Computational Information Systems Lab, or CISL. And a large part of their work is managing computational resources. And then the figure on the left is kind of going back to that point that I mentioned about grid cells and thinking about climate model resolution. And so when I say resolution, I mean basically the size of those grid boxes. And I like this figure because it shows how that's changed over time, how it's evolved to what we would say higher resolution or finer resolution as the size of the grid boxes decreases. And they've sort of tracked this relative to IPCC reports. So IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're in the news, maybe you've heard of them. And so they've sort of showed how climate model resolution has evolved concurrently with these large scale IPCC reports, which are assessment reports looking at sort of the state of climate and climate projections from models and things like that. So if you just compare like number 1 to number 4, you can see how much of a difference it makes to have these higher resolution simulations. The first one, you can barely get any recognition that that's Europe, but then by the 4th one, you can actually start to pick out topography, and the countries have multiple grid cells that make up their spatial extent. So, for certain simulations that you want to run, you really do need that high resolution. And I'm going to show an example of that on the next slide. So I'm going to try to play a video. I hope this works. This is a video from from colleagues of mine, from colleagues at NCAR, where they ran the CESM, the Community Earth System Model, on a high resolution grid. So by high resolution here, I mean about a 1/4 degree grid box. And just for reference, a 1/4 degree is about 25 kilometers at the equator. So nominally 25 square kilometer boxes covering the globe. And this visualization is showing the surface wind speed output from that model simulation. So, and this is what we would consider high resolution for a global climate model. Now this is just wind, but you can already pick out lots of important and interesting features. For example, I think this first part, this is going to kind of go through the course of a year. This first part is going to show some mid-latitude storms. So coming off Eastern Asia, coming across the Pacific Ocean, and really being able to see these features with this high resolution. The other interesting thing is that when these features interact with the land surface, it slows them down. So you don't see the sort of turbulent structures over land, but you do see that over the ocean. And yeah, so it's saying that the land masses in the northern hemisphere slow the storm propagation. I think now we're going to scroll down to the southern hemisphere. This is interesting because you're going to get a snapshot of the Southern Ocean, which is the only place on the Earth where there's no land at certain latitude bands. So you really get high turbulence in this area. I know people have done field work and it's pretty intense to be on a boat in the Southern Ocean. And that's because you don't have any landmass slowing those structures down. And we won't watch this whole video, but the last thing I want to highlight is tropical cyclones. So you can also see the tiny red dots, which are tropical cyclones sort of spinning up and coming across the Pacific. And so especially for things like tropical cyclones, we need a high resolution simulation because otherwise we wouldn't be able to pick out these features. So there's lots more videos of like this on a YouTube page that I can always send the link to, but I think I'll stop it there so we can move on. So I wanted to kind of show my workflow as a climate modeler. I think this is helpful because it touches on a lot of different things that I think about, and the fact that it's more of a cycle than like a linear flow of doing this kind of research. So if you start from the top left over here, you know, we have to kind of start from thinking about designing simulations, and what that means is like which model components we want to focus on. Do we want to focus on everything or just the atmosphere or just the land or the ocean? We have to figure out what resolution we want to run the simulations, what time period, what spatial area. And so all of that goes into kind of designing the simulation. Then if you go to the next part of the cycle, running the climate models, which requires some software engineering, you know, the interaction with high performance computing. And then finally analyzing the output. So this is just an example of a simulation I ran, and I was looking at temperature changes. But the key is that analyzing that output might also lead you to have more ideas for simulations. So that's why it's sort of a cycle. Like, that leads back into designing additional simulations. And the other thing I want to mention is that the analyzing, you know, the data analysis does require us to use a lot of these, you know, tools for software and data analysis. And I suspect that there's probably some commonalities across, you know, research in physics. So I just wanted to highlight some of the tools that we use at NCAR. We're kind of trying to shift to more Python-based tools. So these are some of the things that I'm using for my research right now. So yeah, we're using climate models to study future changes and uncertainties. And I want to highlight a particular way that we can use climate models just to look at global average surface temperature changes. So this is a figure from the IPCC, and it's showing sort of historical changes in temperature in black. And then starting in 2005, some simulations that are projecting future changes. There's a couple of interesting things shown here. The first is just that there's two different what we call future emission scenarios. So RCP stands for representative concentration pathway. But basically it just means like we don't know what humans are going to do. We don't know how much we're going to emit in the future in terms of greenhouse gases. So we run these different scenarios to say like, okay, one could be a high emission scenario, one could be a low emission scenario, like what's in the red versus the blue. But the other interesting thing is that we also see that there's this spread in the blue and the red lines. And I didn't mention this yet, but these numbers are the number of different model simulations that were run, where the bold line is the mean of those simulations, and the spread is sort of shown in the shading. So that's really interesting because, you know, we can ask the question, well, why do different models give us slightly different answers? The overall picture doesn't change. We still know this high emission scenario, the temperatures are going to warm by a certain amount, but there's some amount of uncertainty in that estimation. And so we can sort of ask the question, well, why do different models give us different answers? Like so far, I've just talked about one model in particular, but there's actually dozens of different climate models across the world that different groups have developed. And so the short answer to that question of why do different models give us different answers is that the Earth system is really complicated. And so these models are trying to represent lots of different processes, like I showed at the beginning, in all of these individual grid cells. So I like this figure because it starts to get at the hyper complexity of these Earth system models, really integrating lots of different processes, processes in the ocean, even getting down to the phytoplankton that consume CO2 and change the flux of carbon between the ocean and the atmosphere, or the same sort of processes on land with trees exchanging carbon, energy, water. And then also starting to integrate more human influences on the land surface, like agriculture and deforestation. So we need to represent a lot of processes. We don't know how to do that perfectly because we don't have perfect observations of every point on the globe. We have a lot of observations, but we can always use more. And so each of the models are trying their best to represent the physics, chemistry, and biology of these processes. But it's actually good that we have slightly different representations, people's sort of best estimate of these processes, because then it tells us something about the uncertainty in projecting, for example, changes in surface temperature. So I want to shift gears a little bit now just to get to some of the specific work that I've done with the land component of CESM in particular. So this is the community land model, or CLM is the name of the component of CESM that just models the land surface. So I'm going to talk about work that I've done just with that model component. And I want to start by, again, coming back to this idea of complexity of these processes, but also how that complexity has changed over time. So this is a figure from two of my colleagues, Rosie Fisher and Charlie Coven, trying to demonstrate how the complexity of land surface modeling has changed, or the evolution of land surface modeling. And so what they've done is they've sort of diagrammed how land surface modeling has changed, even like starting in the 70s, when land surface models were really developed to be a boundary condition for these atmosphere models, which were developed earlier. But as time went by, more and more processes were added to these models, both from a practical standpoint and also to try and get more realistic representations of how the land might influence the atmosphere and vice versa. So you can see how this sort of growing out over time, first adding very basic land processes having to do with soils and plants, then actually differentiating between different plants in what we call plant functional type distinctions, then adding things like lakes and rivers, increasing the complexity of the carbon cycle, adding more human influences on the land surface, until we get to today where we have a lot of different processes that we have to keep track of just in the land. And so again, this complexity leads to uncertainty in our land model projections. And this is a figure that is now just showing a bunch of different climate carbon cycle models. So each line is a different model. And this is showing the annual land flux on the y-axis. So what I mean by that is the flux of carbon either in or out of the land. If it's positive, it's into the land. If it's negative, it's out of the land. And so each line is a different simulation, different model, but they're all forced by the same future climate scenario, the RCP 8.5 that I showed earlier. But you can see how as you run these models over time out to projecting to year 2100, not only do the models disagree on the magnitude, but they also disagree on the sign. So here's the 0 line right here. And again, the sign matters because if it's positive, then the land is a carbon sink, meaning it's taking up carbon from the atmosphere, which is good, which it does now, which we want it to keep doing. But if it's negative, it means that the land is a carbon source. So this has really important broad implications for the global carbon cycle. And other researchers have shown that this spread is largely due to uncertainty in the structure and the parameters in these land models. So I'm going to talk specifically about parameters in land models, and in particular, the NCAR land model, the community land model. So I want to, again, come back to this question of why do different models give us different answers? We think it has something to do with land model parameters. What is a land model parameter? So as an example, I'm going to show an example of a parameter, but I want to start with this overview figure of the community land model, or CLM. And it's helpful to kind of separate the processes that this land model considers into 3 different groups. So we have surface energy fluxes, so the land is handling the kind of input of the radiation and the interaction of radiation with vegetation and soils, and then the emission of long-wave radiation and surface heat fluxes. We also have a whole subset of processes that just have to do with hydrology. So we have precipitation coming into the land, either as rain or snow. We have that interacting with the vegetation. We have lots of processes having to do with soil hydrology or water movement in the soils. And then we have a whole set of processes that have to do with biogeochemistry. So by that, I mean carbon and nitrogen cycling in the vegetation. So I wanted to show an example of a parameter, because remember, we're trying to account for all of these different processes in the models in terms of like physical equations that we can program. But just as an example, I'm going to talk about the relationship between photosynthesis, which is the carbon uptake by plants, and transpiration, which is the flux of water from the soils through the plant into the atmosphere. And a process that has to do with both of these is called stomatal conductance. So what do I mean by stomatal conductance? So if you start on the left here, this figure is showing sort of zoomed in on the surface of the leaf. And there's these tiny holes on the surface of the leaf. Those are called stomata. They allow CO2 to come into the leaf, which the leaves need to photosynthesize, to grow. But at the same time, water can escape. And so plants really face a trade-off when it comes to opening their stomata, because they need that carbon, but they don't want to lose too much water. Now, we can observe this process called stomatal conductance, which is basically how open the stomata are, and relate that process to photosynthesis and come up with some linear relationship between those two. This is an example of some observations of those quantities. And it turns out that for our models, the slope of this line that we might fit to these data is an important model parameter. But as you can see, there's a fair amount of spread around that line. So its value is somewhat uncertain. And here I'm just showing exactly how this parameter, which is represented by G1 here, that is an equation in the model. And it turns out to be a really important equation because it has implications for photosynthesis, carbon, and transpiration, water. And so we would really like to know the value of this parameter, and especially how it changes for different plant types. But there's some uncertainty. And so in the past, when scientists have tried to reduce uncertainties or come up with the right parameter values, it sometimes turns into a game of whack-a-mole, where you fix one thing in the model and then it breaks something else, because you're trying to simultaneously fit to observations dozens, potentially hundreds of different processes. So my colleague Rosie Fisher kind of came up with this diagram where you might update a parameter, then it gets a little bit better, but then you have another choice where you have to have two different algorithms or two different locations. And so eventually maybe you get to this better, different, but still reasonable parameter value that gives you better answers. But the process itself, if you're sort of hand tuning, takes a long time. It takes a lot of model runs. It takes a lot of trial and error. And this is probably analogous to other systems where we're trying to calibrate or optimize certain models to reduce biases. So what I wanted to do with some of my work at NCAR is to ask the question, can we use machine learning to streamline this process? And we've been talking about how, at NCAR and with the broader climate community, how we can use machine learning to integrate into our work to improve model biases. And so this was kind of an experiment to say, can we use machine learning techniques to help streamline this process? So I'll just take like 2 slides to just back up a little and talk about the motivation for using machine learning. I like to start with this figure that shows that when we use these terms, somewhat interchangeably, they are kind of distinct, where deep learning is a subset of machine learning, which is a subset of artificial intelligence. And when I'm talking about machine learning, I'm talking about using algorithms that their performance improves as you give it more data. And there's a really nice paper, a recent paper by Marcus Reichstein and others that looks at how common machine learning tasks from like computer science fields can be applied to earth science. And so these are other things that we're looking at NCAR. I don't have time to talk about them today, but things like using object classification to pick out a cat or a dog in an image. Can we apply that to earth science and actually use pattern classification to pick out extreme events in a map? So for example, this is showing tropical cyclones, TCs, that have been picked out using the same sort of image classification. Another potential example is using video prediction techniques to that sort of predict future visuals, apply that to short-term forecasting. So another thing we care a lot about is prediction in climate sense. So can we apply some of those techniques to a prediction problem? So I'm not really going to talk about the specifics of these, but this is a really interesting paper if you want to learn more. What I'm going to talk about is using machine learning in the form of an artificial neural network, which I'll talk about more in a couple slides, what that is, using it as an emulator for the land model. So what do I mean by an emulator? Why would we do this? So the reason that it's difficult to test a lot of parameter values with a land model is that these models are computationally expensive. They require dozens, hundreds of CPU hours to run adequate simulations to test these different parameter values. So our idea was, let's use machine learning to build a simpler version of the land model, an emulator or a surrogate model that we can then use to test lots of different land model parameter values and get the predictions that we would get if we ran the full model. So that has a lot of computational savings that I'll talk about later. And I just want to go through kind of a roadmap for the rest of the talk in terms of how I'm using machine learning. So the first step is to use these neural networks to build and train a set of emulators that will predict the land model output given parameter values as input. The second is then to actually apply them as an emulator to make predictions with vastly increased computational efficiency. Then we can actually bring in the observations. So we can ask the question, what parameter values minimize the model bias or minimize the error in the predictions relative to observations? And finally, we can take those parameter values and test them with the full model and see if we've actually made improvements in the model's skill. So I'm going to go through sort of each of these steps for the remainder of the talk. So I've already mentioned neural networks a couple of times. Some of you may be familiar with them as tools, as sort of deep learning, machine learning tools. But I thought I would just say that neural network basics are we're trying to learn a functional relationship between a set of input and a set of output. And so this is a supervised machine learning problem where we know the input values, the parameters, and we use a set of simulations that we've run with the land model so that we know the output. And like any curve fitting exercise, we're trying to fit a function to this data. But the other important part is that we want this function to be able to generalize to new values. So that's kind of the concept behind training and validation data in machine learning. So why would we even use machine learning? I mean, other than the computational efficiency that I mentioned, some advantages to using it are that we can then ask questions on interpretability. So why does this particular functional form work well? And what about the inputs and what about the outputs, provide the most skill? So those are kind of some interesting questions that we can uniquely get with machine learning. And we can also apply it in lots of other contexts. But as with any machine learning approach, we need to make sure that we're not building bias into our algorithms. So coming back to this image and really showing what happens as part of this training process. So again, this is a supervised machine learning problem where we have input to the neural network as land model parameter values and an ensemble, which I'll talk about in a couple slides, of model simulations that serves as the training data. And so we're using the machine learning to predict land model output given the parameter values as input. I briefly mentioned an example of a parameter a couple slides back, but I just wanted to put up here the parameters that I looked at in this project. There were hundreds of parameters to choose from, and we only looked at 6. So kind of just starting to scratch the surface of this. So I narrowed it down because I wanted to look at a specific set of land processes. I ran a whole set of simulations just to test the sensitivity of these parameters that I don't have time to talk about today. But we landed on a set of 6 parameters, one of which is the parameter I showed you in the beginning, the stomatal conductance photosynthesis relationship. But the other ones have to do with things like evaporative fluxes, soil hydrology, runoff, things like that. So I can come back to these if there's questions, but I think in the interest of time, we'll just move on to generating the training data, which is also a really important part of doing any sort of machine learning problem. And so I mentioned this, this idea of an ensemble on a previous slide. And so what I did to generate training data is I used those 6 parameters. I generated 100 different combinations of those. And I used something called Latin hypercube sampling, but essentially it's just spanning the full space of what I think are the possible values for that parameter. So I didn't really say this before, but like if a parameter has a default value of say 5 in the model, but we think that observations show that that value could be as low as 4 or as high as 6, I use that range to sort of sample in that space and then run the model with those different combinations. And so what that gives you is an ensemble of simulations where each simulation is going to show a different climate because you have slightly different changes in parameter values. And so an example of that is this distribution here, where I'm showing a particular model output, which happens to be spatial variability of gross primary production, or GPP, but you can just think of that as photosynthesis. So I'm decomposing the global simulation results from each of these ensemble members using PCA, principal component analysis, because I want to preserve some of the spatial variability and not just take global mean values, but I want to have like a very clear metric to be able to predict with the emulator. So it's easier to do that when you're predicting a single value versus a whole spatial map. So again, I can talk about this more if there are questions, but there are a variety of choices that kind of went into how we designed this. Now this distribution may not be that intuitive, so I'm also sort of showing just as background the associated spatial patterns. So when you do a PCA or an EOF, empirical orthogonal function, you can come up with sort of the the PCA amplitudes, which is what I used in the emulator, but you can also come up with spatial patterns. So this is kind of neat because you can see how the first mode, EOF1 of GPP, is very much a tropical signal. And then I also looked at the second and third modes. I stopped at the third mode because these numbers here are the percentages of variability, and it was really basically noise after the third EOF. But spatially, you can see how they represent different parts of the globe, which is kind of interesting. And there's more details in this paper here. Okay, let's come back to this figure again and be a little bit more specific. So still talking about the training, you can just think of the input to the training as a table of values. So again, I have 6 parameters and I have 100 different simulations that I've run with those parameter values. So each row is like a simulation. And then more specifically, I'm training this certain type of neural network, so 2-layer feed-forward artificial neural network, to predict 3 different outputs. And those are what I just showed you on the previous slide, which are the modes of variability of gross primary production, or GPP. As a side note, I built a separate emulator for latent heat flux, but I won't really talk about that today. I did want to kind of span a range of processes in the model that I was predicting. So the first step in the training, once the sort of system parameters are set, is to say, okay, are we actually getting good performance from this emulator? How does it compare to the complex land model? And so this is results from my sort of best emulator performance, again, trained on random parameter values and model output. So what we'd like to see is a very good one-to-one correlation along this line. And in fact, we do see that. We see that the predictions on the y-axis very well match the model output. But I was also able to extend this to a second ensemble. So this is results showing the same emulator with different set of parameter values and output, where this is a completely separate validation set that wasn't part of the training process. And the key takeaway here is that the predictive skill is very much comparable if you look at the R-squared values. So what this is showing us is that we have some ability to generalize to unseen values, which is always a good thing when you're training a machine learning model. So now that we think that we have a well-trained network, we can actually move on to the emulation step. And so this is inputting new unseen parameter values to the trained neural network emulator. And now we're getting land model predictions in orange. And here I'm just comparing distribution of the predictions to the original in blue. And I really want to emphasize the speed here. So I talked about computational efficiency before. That's why we're doing this. It is much more efficient to run these parameter values through this neural network emulator than the original model. In fact, if you want to put numbers on it, you know, these particular simulations that I was running took about 2 hours per simulation, and that's actually pretty fast for a climate model, but that has to do with the choices that I made in designing the simulation. But the neural network takes seconds to run these predictions. So this is like a really key aspect for doing this kind of parameter calibration experiment. Okay, I think I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but this is just some work showing which parameters were most important to the prediction of these different things. And again, there's more details in the paper here if you're interested, but it ends up being related to certain processes. Like, it's cool that we can then relate back the skill that we're getting from this machine learning model to actually specific processes. And you know, we're going to continue looking more closely at those processes going forward. So I want to get to step 3, which is the calibration step. So here's where we use our emulator and we bring in the observations. And I mentioned before that one of the reasons we're doing this is we'd like to try and reduce biases in the model. And by that, I mean the mismatch between the observations and the actual model. And so this bar chart is showing for these different metrics, the first 3 modes of GPP. The observations are in red, so those are kind of our target values. The black is showing the default model performance. It's really close to 0, which is why you can't see it here. So we'd like the black and the red to be close together. And so what we've done is we've run an optimization problem where we've said, okay, let's try and come up with the parameters that best fit the observations. And so you can compare the blue and the red and say, is the blue getting closer to the red? Well, it certainly is for the first mode, questionable for the higher modes, and there's reasons we can talk about for those. But then the next step is the testing step, and that's this green line here. So what we can do is then take the blue, which is all in emulator world, it's all sort of in the neural network, take those particular parameter values that are the optimal ones, go back and run the full model, and then look at how the results compare. So what we're seeing, we're able to compare a couple different neat things here. We can look at how well the optimized neural network NN predictions in blue match the model tested with those in green. And we'd like to see them to be very close because that means that our emulator is doing a good job. But we can also compare the green with the red and the black. Is the green moving closer to the red? And that's also what we want to see because that means we're reducing the model biases and we're getting closer to observations. But this is just in principal component space, which again, isn't as intuitive. You might be wondering, well, what does this look like spatially? Like, what does this look like on a map? So that's what I'm showing here. This is two different comparisons. On the right, we have the default model compared to observation. So this is kind of where we started from. And this is a map of GPP, or photosynthesis. So we know that we started with some biases in terms of places that had too high GPP and places that had too low GPP. And so what we want to see on the left, which is our optimized model, is we want to see those areas get better. And I think what we found from this exercise, this experiment, is that we found some mixed results. We found that overall the global annual mean biases got better, but the regional and seasonal results were mixed. And there's a couple of potential reasons for that I'll just sort of briefly mention here. We know that there's other sources of uncertainty that we're not considering in this problem because I've just really talked about the uncertainty in very specific parameter values. For this paper, we only looked at two output variables, GPP and latent heat flux, and I'm only showing the GPP results here. But obviously, there's other model outputs that we could look at and see if we're sort of getting any improvement there. And another key aspect, I think, is that we're using, in terms of our metrics, we're using annual mean spatial variability as determined by the PCA, so the principal components. And what I mean by that is we're not taking into account temporal variability, and especially for something like GPP, photosynthesis, the seasonal cycle, just like I mentioned from the very first slide, is really important. And so we're thinking about how we could redo this or test a different metric that might account for some of those changes seasonally, so not just looking at annual means. So we have lots of ideas for kind of how to take this forward. But I just want to hit on a few summary points before I wrap up. So I think that parameter choices are really important and major contribution to uncertainty in land model predictions. We've seen this in other work. Here we're using neural networks as a machine learning algorithm, and we're able to train those neural networks to be an emulator of the land model with much greater computational efficiency than actually running different parameter tests one by one. And we've optimized these emulator predictions to try and reduce model biases, minimize error between model and observations. And finally, I think that this demonstrates that we can use machine learning to help us both understand and communicate uncertainty in how we model climate projections. So this is the details on the paper that I mentioned a couple times if you're interested to learn more about this work. I also want to mention other things that we do at NCAR and UCAR, just if folks are interested. There's lots of different opportunities, fellowship opportunities, summer internships, undergraduate, graduate programs. I'm happy to share these slides so you can have these links. I've been able to mentor for several of these programs, particular SOARS, which is an undergrad research program, and UCAR Next Generation Fellows, which is a PhD level internship. But there's lots of different opportunities. So I would encourage you to look those up if you're interested. And I think I'm just going to end there with a few more fun photos and things that I've been able to do at NCAR. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions.
All right, thank you. We have time for some questions. So I see that Dr. Hooper has his hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, Katie, thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting. So my question for you is this. I'm always interested in people who've, attacked certain problems with some machine learning techniques of various kinds. Can you talk about maybe the biggest surprise or the biggest contributor that was, like you said, maybe came out of this, was surprising out of your analysis, like something that contributed a bigger effect than you would sort of naively have thought previously?
Yeah, I can. I think I'm actually going to go back to a slide that I had to kind of talk about quickly. But so this whole idea of, well, we knew that the emulator was going to be a lot faster to test out these different parameters. What I didn't expect is that certain parameters, especially for GPP, which is on the left here, like one parameter out of the 6 was extremely dominant in terms of the skill that it, or the contribution that it had to the skill of the emulator. So essentially what I'm saying is, like, for a particular process that we thought all of these parameters are going to be important for that process, it was really only one that dominated. And so that allowed us to go back and look more closely at how that process is represented in the model. What are the assumptions that we're making? And we're actually now revising both like the structure and the range of parameter values that we're using for this particular parameter, because we've realized that it was so dominant in the predictive skill. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's that kind of stuff is, I think, interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Parker.
Hey, thanks so much for your talk. It was really, really informative. I got a couple questions. One is easy. Your institute is funded from which government agency?
Primarily NSF, but a lot of us have individual grants from places like NOAA and DOE.
All right, DOE, that was the one I was curious about, because I guess my my interest or comment is in your modeling space. I think some of the best science gets done throughout history if it's met with a little bit of strife. In other words, if there's, counter positions to things that are going on, where do you as a modeler get kind of pushback on the models and things you're generating?
Well, I think this question of just comparing results with different climate models is really interesting. And I think we can learn a lot from what other groups are doing in terms of, both like what observations they're using, what approaches they're using to their climate model predictions. And then also, especially specific to DOE, there's been a really big push for incorporating more machine learning and artificial intelligence. So that's why we're thinking about things like, I'll go back to this slide. We're thinking about other ways that we can use machine learning in our work, not just for this particular example that I showed, but for things like extreme weather and applying some of the tools that the computer science and the computer vision community has had decades developing, but then actually like bringing those people together with earth scientists to really get the best of both worlds in terms of maybe seeing how we can use machine learning in our work. So yeah, those are some things that come to mind.
Okay, thanks. One quick follow-up then too. I noticed a lot of the data was representative of about maybe 100 years. Do you take your models and borrow, even though it's bulk phenomena, not the high resolution like you were showing on, I think it was slide 9, when you showed that nice wind video? Do you go back and look at kind of the geohistory of the Earth to kind of say these were different periods and there were different things going on then, and adopt those into your models as you project forward?
Absolutely, that's really important. And you're right. It's going to be very limited by the observations that we have. So a lot of times we're going back like to 1850, where we have good temperature observations, or this only goes back to 1950. But yeah, so using both sort of well-observed periods in like the satellite era starting in the 1970s, but also using examples from paleoclimate. So there's a whole set of colleagues that I have at NCAR who are interested in paleoclimate. So they're really digging into, thousands, millions of years ago, and even like running simplified model configurations where you have to change like the continental configuration because it was different in the past, but absolutely using that to inform how we project changes in the future.
I was just raising the point only from the standpoint of, because I'm a materials person, and before an electron microscope was invented, the Japanese 1,000 years ago were making great steel, and it had a lot to do with the microscopy and the composition. So there was like kind of bulk empirical evidence from 1,000 years ago that kind of became evident as we got more, as your pointing out, as the resolution got better. So I was just curious if you kind of adapted those types of principles. So that's good to know. Thanks. Appreciate you taking the time for us today.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Daniel, you have your hand up.
Hello, I'd just like to thank you so much for coming out. This presentation was great, and I definitely learned a lot. I recall that you said that you were able to use machine learning to reduce your models from having a 2-hour operating window to several seconds. And then I also recall that you said that you use 6 main parameters for your models. So I guess my question is, do you often find yourself making a choice between efficiency or complexity of your models?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what this project was all about. Several steps along the way. Like I mentioned, now we've done a sort of comprehensive assessment of the number of parameters just in the land model, and we think it's like something like 200. And we're going to do a different experiment in the next couple of months where we actually try and test all of those 200. But for me, when I was starting on this work, we wanted a manageable space to start from computationally. So 6 is somewhat of an arbitrary number, but like I mentioned, we did a bunch of experiments to kind of come up with that list of 6. But you're right, it absolutely was a trade-off where we had to say, okay, we've got to make some perhaps subjective choices, but we're going to try to do them as objectively as possible. So pick like the 6 top parameters that we think are really important. But it's nice that it seems like we're going to be able to go back and look at some others as well.
Yeah, as scientists, I often find that we have to make choices like that quite often. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, do we have any other questions? All right, Dr. Kosminski has his hand up.
I just wanted to say thank you one more time for coming to talk to us today. And also for the students that are out there, you probably noticed the tools that they're using to build these models are Python-based tools. So, this is another opportunity for you as you develop those programming and coding skills during your undergraduate years. This is another application of those skills. So I really appreciate you coming out, Katie, to talk to us today, and let's thank her.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you.
All right, take care.
All right, looks like everybody's logging off now. Thank you so much for